Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Paramita Chattaraj from the School of Law, KIT University. Today we will be discussing about the module, the prison system, historical perspectives and contemporary relevance. The learning objectives are to make the learners understand the evolution of imprisonment as a mode of punishment, to make the learners understand the origin and development of the prison system from the ancient to the modern times, to acquaint the learners with the different types of prison systems, to acquaint the learners with the contemporary relevance of prison system. To introduce today's topic, punishment has been a response to wrongs committed by any person from time immemorial. However, there are various rationales to justify such infliction of punishment. According to Jeremy Bentham, all punishments is mischief, all punishment is in itself evil. Since causing of deliberate pain is wrongful, does this make punishment wrong? There are two lines of thoughts here. One believing that inflicting pain as punishment is fundamentally different from inflicting pain on innocence and therefore is not inherently wrong. Secondly, that punishment is a wrong that can be justified only if it results in a greater good. Those who hold the first view do not feel it necessary to justify punishment, beyond the fact that the individual deserves it. This would be considered a retributive approach. Whereas, the second view justifies punishment through the secondary rationales of deterrence, incapacitation or rehabilitation. This is the utilitarian approach. Punishment in society are as old as civilization itself. Though imprisonment as a mode of punishment per se was not always in use. There are two forms of prison, jowl or jail. The form jowl still commonly survives in England, whereas the term jail is in vogue in the American system. Jowl is derived from the Latin word joule, that means to seize. Prison as a place of detention have been there both inside and outside since a very long time. However, the idea of imprisonment in the prison system as we know it today is not the old an idea. Historical perspectives of the prison system as we discuss it, punishment targets one's possessions, one's body, one's psyche. Punishment throughout the ages have attacked the body, allowing different forms of corporal punishments including drawing and quartering, flaying, whipping, beheading, dismembering and number of means of torture or death, fines and dispossession of property also have been common throughout the history. Conley writes that fines were more common than physical torture during many times period. Execution was an economic as well as a corporate punishment because the person's estate was forfeited to the monarch. Economic and physical sanctions gradually have given way to imprisonment or lesser deprivations of liberty like probation and parole. As early as the end of 14th century, the purpose of imprisonment changed from custody until physical punishment was inflicted to custody as punishment itself. An increasing number of laws emerged with precisely defined prison sentences. The church also used imprisonment as a punishment for clerics. It came to be realized that the process of imprisonment involving in the isolation from family and community under not so pleasant conditions could itself as a convenient mode of punishment to replace corporeal punishment. Although prisons in shape of dungeons had existed from time immemorial in all the old civilizations of the world, it was only in the middle of the 19th century that imprisonment became the main form of punishment. Cantor observed, imprisonment is the modern major method of disposing serious offenders. It is difficult to imagine surrendering this method. it was just as difficult to surrender the practice of torture in the Middle Ages or public execution for every felony in England. A brief sketch of the methods of punishment in the past will show how firmly different ages clung to those current practices which to us today appear barbaric. Let us first come to Europe. In England, in 1166, King Henry II issued the Essays of Clarendon, which ordered his sheriffs to build the jail in each county. Jails held debtors and felons awaiting trial. In 1556, the first house of correction or workhouse was established at Bridewell, and in 1906, James I made such houses of correction, popularly referred to as Bridewells, obligatory in every English county. These facilities held people who were sent to prison for a very short sentence. Alongside this, the workhouses enshrined the principle of less eligibility and was intimately linked to the birth of the prison. However, by the 18th century, workhouses or bridewells had lost their original purpose, because judges increasingly resorted to corporeal punishments or transportation to the colonies for vagrants. The sheriffs and magistrates of the English counties did not assume any direct responsibility for maintenance of jails or for treatment of occupants. This was turned over to the private keeper as a concession. The keepers were not paid any salary, and their income came from fees extracted from the prisoners or their friends and relatives. The fee system continued in England for several centuries. The 16th century Protestants' impulse to banish idleness and beggary provided a second precursor to the penitentiary in the Amsterdam Rasp House and Skin House, founded in 1596 and 1597 respectively. Through these workhouses, the magistrates sought to establish houses of discipline where inmates could be put to work in order to learn industrious habits. Amsterdam provided a model of European house of correction where a new class of deviants and convicts sentenced to forced public labours. In practice, these states workshops were used not as reformatories, but used as places where a diverse population of unfortunate ingredients was coerced with hard labour. But neither the English bridewell nor the continental workhouses served the purpose of penitentiary. The two institutions that influenced the prison system in America and England are firstly the Hospice of San Michel, which was the reformatory for the boys established in Rome by Pope Clement the 11th in 1703. Secondly, the Maison de Force, a house of correction opened by Jean-Jacques Philippe Villon in Ghent, Belgium in 1773. The Rome Reformatory has been accepted by some leading authorities as the first modern prison. Its principal purpose was moral regeneration through penitence and reflection in cellular isolation at night and congregate work under strict rule of silence during the day. The House of Correction of Belgium could be considered as one of the first long-term convict prisoners. During the 18th century, John Howard emerged as a formidable prison reformer. Howard began a series of inspection to his country prisons as county sheriff of the Bedfordshire from 1773 onwards. His contribution lay in his effort in his systematic statistical reporting and comprehensive proposals for change. He advocated for solitary confinement and hoped to translate the ascetic vigil of the priest into the disciplinary regime of the criminal. His plans for better prison, food, clothing and hygiene were but part of a reform program intended to reset minds as well as disciplined bodies. Howard's humanitarian reforms were sometimes criticized as too expensive and lenient, but he was still regarded as one of the great reformers of the prison reforms. The other significant reformer in this era was Jeremy Bentham. The Panopticon, or the perfect prison as it was known, was designed by Jeremy Bentham and would become the model of prisons for the next century. Its design, which is a square wheel with cell blocks arranged like spokes around the hub, enabled total separation of prisoners while allowing a guard to be placed at the central location to thus observe all the prisoners in the various wings. The separation, isolation and design as a whole were considered integral for the rehabilitation, and thus its intrinsic features were extensively argued amongst dueling reformers. The emergence of penitentiary as a response of the criminal justice system was part of a broader process of institution building that included the rise of factory, free elementary schools, general hospitals, mental hospitals, orphanages and other asylums for the dependent and deviant. The prisoners, by remodeling the society for better public mutations and executions, seem to have lost their efficiency as a deterrent to crime. In 1779, the British Parliament abolished branding and amended the laws relating to transportation, imprisonment and other punishment. To take care of the prisoners who had been formerly transported to America, Britain passed the Hulk Act of 1776, which was the first move towards a convict prison. These floating prisons were actually floating hells, rife with diseases, and many prisoners lost their lives in these miserable wooden coffins. Thereafter, prison reformers like William Eden, William Blackstone and John Howard introduced the Penitentiary Act of 1779. These reforms have been introduced in response to end of transportation to USA, and when transportation to Australia started, the reform movement lost some momentum. In 1810, however, Samuel Romilly, a renowned reformer, argued that Penitentiary Act should be resurrected. The government responded by appointing the Holford Committee, which recommended that a convict prison should be built. It was to be placed at Millbank, London. The convict prison was born, although it had clearly been a hard labour. In 1842, Her Majesty's Prison, Pentonville, was opened. It held 520 prisoners in separate cells and became the new model prison of the Victorian era. Its regime was based on solitude, hard labour, religious indoctrination and surveillance. In 1865, the Prison Act finally ended the official difference between jails and houses of correction, renaming the local prisons, and in 1877, the Prison Act gave the Home Office the control of prison system. Following this period, the modern period was to become the ultimate sanction of the state. Now going to the American prison system. In 1786, America began to examine its own prison system, and during this time, the first prison reform societies started to form. The Quaker group, called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, worked in 1780s and 90s to replace corporal punishment with the use of imprisonment to treat criminals for their wrongdoings. They suggested this be done by combining the ideas of American prisons along with those of the English workhouses, which would allow for a more permanent dwelling for the accused. Their ideas did not remain in force for very long throughout the colonies, but their influence was everlasting. Even after the Revolutionary War, their new criminal codes, which approached punishment more humanely, rapidly spread from Philadelphia to other states. The Enlightenment perhaps played a huge role in prison reform, as the idea that social institutions formed character came into play. This led to the first penal system in America in the form of the Pennsylvania system. In this system, the method of punishment was based on the principle of solitary confinement. fosters penitence and encourages reformation. The Quakers advocated this idea. In 1829, the Eastern State Penitentiary on Cherry Hill in Philadelphia applied this so-called separate philosophy. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement in cells. An exercise yard completely enclosed to prevent contact among prisoners was attached to each cell. Prisoners saw no one except institution officers and an occasional visitor. Solitary penitence, however, was soon modified to include the performance of work such as shoemaking or weaving. The Pennsylvania system spread until it predominated in European prisons. Critics in the United States argued that it was too costly and had deleterious effects on the minds of the prisoners. The Pennsylvania system was superseded in the United States by the Auburn system. Now, to highlight the Auburn system, this was the penal methods of the 19th century in which persons worked during the day and were kept in solitary confinement at night, with enforced silence at all times. The silence system evolved during the 1820s at the Auburn prison in Auburn, New York, as an alternative to the modification of the Pennsylvania system of solitary confinement, which it gradually replaced in the United States. Later innovations at Auburn were lockstep, marching in single line, placing the right hand on the shoulder of the man ahead and facing towards the guard, and the striped suit, 2-foot extensions of the walls between cells, and special seating arrangements at meals, all designed to secure strict silence. The Auburn and Pennsylvania systems were both based on a belief that criminal habits were learned and reinforced by other criminals. Auburn became known as congregate system, while Pennsylvania became known as separate system, as it espoused silence and separateness of prisoners at all times. While the two systems differed primarily regarding the time spent in solitary confinement, they maintained numerous similarities. They both strove to maintain discipline by enforcing stringent rules which revolved around mandatory labor, silence and discipline. In 1821, prison administrators at Auburn designed an experiment to test the efficacy of the Pennsylvania system. They took 80 of the men they felt were most resistant to reform and placed them in the solitary confinement, enforcing idleness for a period ranging from Christmas of 1821 to Christmas of 1823. While the design was criticized as certain as facets did not accurately match that of the Pennsylvania system, the results were however conclusive. Most of the men became mentally or physically sick, leading to the early termination of the experiment. The South adopted a punishment philosophy based on impending economic needs. Their system was based not on philanthropic ideas, but on the idea that possession of a convict's person is an opportunity for the state to make money. This philosophy took the form of the convict lease system, which served as a slavery model for rebuilding a war-ravaged economy and infrastructure. In the leasing system, inmates were sent anywhere in the United States that demanded labor. The voice of dissent and outrage regarding the system began to grow, as did the levels of crime. Various reporting agencies and commissions began to report that the system was actually increasing recidivism rates. Now coming to India. First, let us discuss about the ancient Indian system. The early prisons were only places of detention where an offender was detained until trial and judgment and the execution of the latter. The structure of the society in ancient India was founded on the principles enunciated by Manu and explained by Yagnavalkya, Kautilya and others. Among various types of corporal punishments, branding, hanging, mutilation and death, the imprisonment was the mildest kind of penalty known prominently in ancient penology. Imprisonment occupied an ordinary place among the penal treatment, and this type of corporal punishment was suggested in Hindu scriptures. The evildoer was put into prison to segregate him from the society. These prisons were totally dark, dense, cool and damp, unlighted and unwarmed. There was not proper arrangement for sanitation and no means of facility for human dwelling. Now coming to the medieval India, imprisonment was not resorted again here as a form of punishment in case of ordinary criminals. It was used mostly as a means of detention only. There were fortresses situated in different parts of the country in which the criminals were detained pending trial and judgment. There used to be 3 noble prisons or castles in Mughal India, one at Gwalior, second one at Ranthambore and the last one at Rohtas. Orders for the prisoners' release were issued on special occasions, like on the occasion of celebration of recovery from illness of a favorite prince or princess or begum or Shah Jahan, and like for example, Shah Jahan ordered the release of prisoners in 1638 AD. Some rooms in the forts popularly known as Bandi Khanas or Adab Khanas were reserved for prisoners, and culprits who had committed serious crimes were sent to such from different places. Let us now discuss about the modern prison. In the modern Indian system, the prison system as it operates today in our country is a legacy of the British rule. It was an ingenious creation of the colonial rulers over our ingenious penal system, which with the prime motive of making imprisonment a terror to wrongdoers. In 1784, the British Parliament empowered the East India Company to rule India, and since then some attempts were made to introduce reforms in the administration of law and justice. At that time, there were 143 civil jails, 75 criminal jails and 68 mixed jails. In fact, these jails were extension of Mughal rule which were managed by the personnel of the East India Company in their efforts to maintain peace and establishment of their trade. In 1835, Lord Macaulay drew the attention of the Legislative Council of India to the deplorable conditions of the Indian jails and proposed to appoint a committee for the purpose of collecting information as to the state of Indian prisons and of preparing an improved plan of prison discipline and to suggest such reforms as may make the place a model for other prisons. The council accepted Macaulay's proposals and appointed the Prison Discipline Committee with Honorable H. Shakespeare as president and Lord Macaulay as one of the members. The report of the committee came out in 1838. The inquiry committee was a landmark in the history of penal administration in India. Prisons were given different treatment, the nature and character of the institution assumed a changed meaning, though it was punitive basically. The committee directed for the first time the attention of English rulers of India to various vices of the administration of Indian jails. It criticized the corruption of subordinate establishment, the laxity of discipline and the system of employing prisoners in extramural labour of public roads. In pursuance of the recommendations of the committee, a central prison was constructed at Agra in 1846. This was first central prison in India and was followed by the construction of central prisons in Bareilly and Allahabad in 1848, at Lahore in 1852, at Madras in 1857, at Bombay in 1864, at Alipur in 1864, at Banaras and Fatehgarh in 1864 and at Lucknow in 1867. In 1844, the first Inspector General of Prisons was appointed in the northwestern province on an experimental basis for 2 years and was extended further in 1850. The government of India made it a permanent post and suggested each province should appoint an Inspector General of Prisons. In 1870, the government of India passed the Prison Act. It laid down that there should be a superintendent, a medical officer, a jailer and a subordinate officer as the local government thinks necessary. It made also provision for the separation of prisoners of male and female, of children offenders from adults, of criminal from civil offenders under section 7 of the Prison Act of 1870. In 1877 and 1889, third and fourth inquiry committees were instituted. Based on the recommendations of the committees, the Prison Act of 1894 was finally passed. In 1919, the British government appointed a joint commission of officials to investigate the whole subject of jail management and to suggest improvement. The commission recommended the establishment of separate institutions like Brostall School for juvenile delinquents. The under trials were to be kept separate from the convicted and the adult convicts were to be classified as habitual and casuals. The committee report also took serious views on transportation of convicts to Andaman Islands and recommended for the discontinuation of the practice of solitary confinement. Quality of food to be improved and prisoners were to be provided with 2 sets of clothing. The commission underlined the idea of reform of inmates as ultimate objective of imprisonment and rehabilitation of prisoners as social necessity. Unfortunately, the prison reform movement received a sudden setback due to the constitutional changes brought about by the Government of India Act of 1919. The Act transferred the jail department from the control of Government of India to that of the provincial government. With the dawn of the independence, prison reform given increased attention. However, Indian leaders were ready with a blueprint for the industrial development of the country, but the jail reform could not escape their eyes as all of them passed their prime life in the jails. Prison administration is a state subject under the Constitution of India. The organization headed by the Inspector General of Prison consists of central prisons, sub-jails or district jails. Different states have adopted different patterns of jail administration. The central jails are intended for long-term prisoners who are convicted in courts. Now focusing on the contemporary relevance of prison system. In last few decades, prison population have increased tremendously, which create number of challenges before the prison administration, like security and safety in prison, hygiene issues, overcrowding, etc. The just deserts rationale and the retributive notion has taken a back seat in the prison system in most civilized jurisdiction. The modern prison system incorporate the rehabilitative ideals, and that is why the period of incarceration is oriented to using the time spent by the inmate for reforming him through education, vocational and other skill based training, and further with mind modulation techniques like yoga and meditation. Although the major challenge is proposed by the over prisonization that leads to overcrowding of prisoners, different response mechanism in the form of privatization of prisons and open prison system and other therapeutic correctional approaches like community service, etc. have come into being. Now let us discuss about open prison system. Criminologists have expressed different views about the definition of open prison. Some scholars have preferred to call these institutions as open air camps, open jail or parole camps. The United Nations Congress on Prevention of Crime and Treatment of Offenders held in Geneva in 1955, however, made an attempt to define an open prison as an open prison institution is characterized by the absence of material and physical precautions against escape such as walls, locks, bars and armed guards, etc., and by a system based on self-discipline and innate sense of responsibilities towards the group in which he lives. Open penal-correctional institutions, open prisons and open colonies for prisoners in the recent past have emerged as effective institutional reformatory and correctional measures. They in fact furnish a halfway home to their inmates for their smooth and effective social, psychological rehabilitation and reintegration into the social mainstream by providing maximum opportunity to their inmates to remold their attitudes and to bring positive changes in their behavioral patterns. These institutions, it is believed, make prisoners fit to lead a law-abiding and self-supporting life after their release. Let us now discuss about community service. Community service programs began in the United States with female traffic offenders in Alameda County, California in 1966, with local initiatives following in several countries throughout the United States. In the United Kingdom, Parliament enacted legislations in the early 1970s, giving the court specific powers to order community service as a sentencing sanction and not just a condition of probation. Community service grew as part of the probation scheme, and probation officers were delegated sole responsibility of securing support for and organizing community service programs. The emphasis of community service is not on punishment nor on rehabilitation, rather it is on accountability. It focuses not on offenders' needs, but their strengths, not on their lack of insight, but their capacity for responsibility, not on their vulnerability to social and psychological factors, but their capacity to choose. These differentiate a rehabilitative response from a restorative or community service response to crime. And punitive elements of community service orders may attend its imposition within a restorative system only as byproducts of the offender's commitment of time and effort. To summarize the discussion, in spite of the above, there are several maladies in the prison system in the country. It would not be appropriate to totally condemn the whole setup. Obviously, there are difficulties of manpower, fund, training and right kind of attitude to deal with socially handicapped inmates, but all these ill needs to be corrected with the joint effort of the government, the people and the staff manning prison institutions. Some prisons are an example of the best utilization of the resources available, and it is educative to see them. Rehabilitative ideals of punishment seeks to present such justification for imprisonment, whereby the seclusion for the sentence duration could be utilized to modulate the offender in such a manner that he could be granted re-entry into the society or community. Imprisonment serves a two-way purpose, the protecting the community and reforming the offenders. Of late, the idea that prison officials serve only to lock and unlock prisoners and to keep them secure is getting replaced by a more interactionist approach. They are being given the responsibility to actively engage with prisoners and participate in their rehabilitation, which in spite of criticism remains the ultimate goal of imprisonment. Thank you.